Welcome to another edition of Economic Forum, where we discuss various issues affecting our economy in Zimbabwe. Today, we want to look at privatization. In most cases, when state institutions are not performing well, there is usually a loud call for privatization. Is privatization synonymous with efficiency and effectiveness and profitability? We're going to be looking at all these things and even asking, why not go the commercialization route if you want to achieve effectiveness and efficiency? To answer all those questions and others, we've invited Rejoice Ngwenya in order to help us understand what privatization is and the advantages that it brings and even the disadvantages, so that as we delve into privatization, we know of some of the pitfalls that we might be going into. Rejoice, welcome to Economic Forum.
Thank you very much, John.
What is privatization?
Well, privatization really is the wholesome transfer of state enterprises, not necessarily state institutions, but state enterprises like parastatals to private hands. Now, the private hands can either be corporate, none of these companies, or individuals that have come together probably on the stock exchange. But in principle, you are simply transferring the ownership and the control and the capitalization of state assets, state enterprises into private hands.
What prompts that? Why would we decide to transfer state institutions, people's institutions as it were, to private hands?
Well, that is the fallacy, John. When you say state-operated companies are public, because they are not necessarily public. They could be state, but they are not public. So the imperative around the privatization is generally, argued against by people and citizens who drive a socialist agenda. There is nothing wrong in a socialist agenda, but there is always a tendency that socialism as an ideology, it promotes a welfare state. So the government is seen as an institution that is benevolent, that is supposed to give everybody everything. So this is where the challenge is, that within that imperative of state control, there is inefficiency, there is corruption, there is rent seeking. So then we liberals, we say the reason why we now have to transfer that public company into private hands is to reverse those negative aspects of inefficiency, corruption, and as you say, profitability, because there is no business that can run without profits.
How have we done as a country with regards to privatization? Coming back from history, have we privatized successfully some of these state institutions that we can be proud of today?
Well, it's a brilliant question, because you know that when we transferred political power from Rhodesia to Zimbabwe, because of international sanctions against Ian Smith, the system in place had created state monopolies, like grain marketing board, cotton marketing board, the post and telecommunications, electricity supply commission. Do you remember those big institutions? Those were created in order to safeguard the security and integrity of the country in terms of delivering service to citizens, because they find a way of going around the sanctions. So we inherited that system, which was pretty socialist in a way. So when we then into independence, there was a realization that the government was spending too much money in public entities that were not delivering the service. That's why it was then necessary for the government in question to begin examining possibilities in the 1980s of privatization. Enter Economic Structural Adjustment Program, the famous ESAP. So ESAP, which economists say was driven by the World Bank and the IMF, was the initial process of privatizing state-controlled enterprises. And, it attracted a lot of controversy. But, of course, as you will see, it's not always the case that when there's privatization, there's a negative vibe around it.
But do we have success stories from that privatization?
Absolutely, John.
Examples.
If I can tell you that we now today have about 4 companies that were privatized that are quoted on the stock exchange. If we're talking about, remember there was an institution called Dairy Marketing Board, which was then privatized into the current company that we have here. There was a Zimbabwe Insurance Corporation, and of course there are other companies like the Cotton Marketing Board, and it did a wonderful job in galvanizing citizens in growing cotton and exporting cotton and value addition.
What are some of the best practices that you can give us around the world that we can also learn from in Africa or elsewhere?
John, unfortunately, the hue and cry against privatization tends to be a bit louder than the success stories. The negative vibes normally are more, heard than positive vibes. But I can actually mention to you that remember when the new Zambian government, and the previous governments privatized the copper belt, there was a lot of hue and cry that you are selling the national treasury to foreigners. But the best example of how privatization can yield results is UK under the governance of the Conservative Party of Margaret Thatcher. They didn't call it
the Iron Lady.
They didn't call it the Iron Lady for. A lot of people think that Thatcher was being called the Iron Lady because of the Falkland crisis of the war against Argentina. But it was her strict adherence to the importance of free market economy. She put down a list of companies. Every company that started with British something had to be privatized.
Is that still the situation today?
It is still the situation.
And still they're successful.
And this is why don't you wish to go to London? I mean, the gas companies are many, or maybe perhaps the infrastructure itself. You can't have 25 companies running gas pipes from the North Sea on. It doesn't work like that. Like we have got our Feruka pipe here. You can't have 25 companies running pipes from Mozambique. So what happens? The model is that you control the infrastructure itself, right? But then you bring in the issue of competition. So there's so much competition even in the telecommunication industry in England. So much so that you can see the benefits of privatization. I mean, England is one of the most efficient public transport systems in the world. It is one of the most efficient electrical delivery systems in the world. So the queen of privatization, who is Margaret Thatcher, and if you go down in South America, Chile, it's got good examples. If you go into the EU in Europe it tends to, wiggle around commercialization because there are a lot of, political parties there that have influence. But I should say that when you talk about the success factor in privatization, you cannot finish the sentence without saying Margaret Thatcher.
Rejoice Ngwenya, an economic analyst, is our guest today, and we're talking about privatization, the pros and cons. We're going to be dealing with that as well. And we are also, Rejoice, going to be telling us the difference between privatization and commercialization in today's edition of Economic Forum. Join us in the second segment. We are now in the second segment of Economic Forum, where today we are discussing privatization with our guest, Rejoice Ngwenya. We've looked at what privatization is, and Rejoice has given us some of the examples around the world and also the history of privatization in Zimbabwe. We mentioned earlier on, Rejoice, that there's also commercialization. Instead of going the privatization route, especially with state enterprises that we very much want to protect, why not commercialize and make them more efficient?
It's very true, John. If you look at the history of privatization in Zimbabwe, you want to go back to the PTC. Remember you and I used to queue for 5 hours to make a call in First Street, and for 6 months to wait for a telephone call. I mean, for a telephone unit, because it was a state-controlled telephone company, right? Because of commercialization. The ideology and the mentality of making money and making profits was then instilled in PTC. In other words, they brought in individuals that had business management skills, how to make money. But that was the first step, because in commercialization, you still do not change the ownership structure of the institution. It is still owned by government. In other words, the government that determines who sits in the board. It determines the capitalization, it determines who gets what kind of funding comes into the company. But the ideology is about making money. No more subsidies. Make sure that whatever you do, you make money. We can then plow back the revenue back into the company. So commercialization is an ideological predisposition about making sure you run the business according to business principles, but the ownership still remains with the government. So that's where you stop, in terms of ownership and of course the structure of the institution.
Maybe at this point you can talk to us about the parastatal reforms that we once talked about, how far we've gone with that. Were those reforms aimed at privatization? Were they aimed at commercialization? Where are we now?
Well, there are a lot of forces. When you are talking about taking assets from the state into private hands, there's a lot of politics. This is why one reason why it is important for government not to be involved in business is because of the politicization of business. So when you then bring in the issue of parastatal reform, it rings, it's a very hollow way, John, of accepting failure and defeat in how to run a business. So I for one, and of course I'm an extreme liberal, you should know that, I don't take parastatal reform seriously. Why? Because you're just moving the items around. You are moving inefficiency from one department to another. Point number two, John, the issue of corruption, right? So there's so much rent seeking in parastatals that when you are reforming, what are you doing? Are you changing the laws, or you are changing the system, the human resource systems? So if you are not changing the laws and HR, then you are not doing anything. You are simply shifting the blame. So reformation must be focused on the outcomes, and the outcome must be profit.
While you're saying that, Rejoice, are you arguing that privatization is always efficient, is corruption-free, everything is always smooth, and yet we read about very big companies internationally that have failed because of corruption and so forth? I think you should make that difference, because I think that's why other people argue against privatization.
In fact, John, if you say other people, you are being conservative. They are highly rated economists and intellectuals who vehemently argue about privatization because of that. They are saying they are big, international organizations and private companies that have failed. So if you are accusing the government of running companies that fail, why don't you point the same to private companies? And they are correct. There's no company that is immune to failure. But here we're talking about the advantages. There are more advantages of efficiency, of price effectiveness, of innovation, of competitiveness, and everything else that come with privatization than those companies that have failed. Why? Because when the government takes charge of resources of citizens, in other words, taxes, they should be deployed efficiently. So if you're going to have a state business that is inefficient, that does not deliver the service, the monopolistic tendencies, there is corruption, and they're doing deals, it doesn't do well for the citizens. You need more accountability. However, it is true that there are big corporations that have failed. But the failure of corporations is easy to deal with. Why? You just, the shareholders sit and say, let's get rid of this board, let's get rid of this manager, right? Let's get rid of this system. But if it's a state institution, John, that has failed, there is a lot of political intrigue that comes with it. It's very difficult. You and I are sitting at the bottom of the ladder. We don't know what is happening in a parastatal. Everything is managed. I could give you 200 examples of how parastatals fail in Zimbabwe. A simple example is when you talk about institutions that provide water, that provide transport, public transport, that provide electricity, that provide even health and education. So when you think around with the management structure and you exclude the ownership structure, you are not achieving anything.
But that happens even in the private sector, Rejoice. I think that's why these economists and also these intellectuals that you mentioned are always arguing against that, because what you've just spelled out also happens in the private sector. But
John, can you imagine if a football team was owned by the government and the coach is failing, is always at the bottom of the league, and has not won a single cup? Would the coach be fired? No.
He will be fired.
By who?
It's decisiveness, and different leaders have different ways of deciding, and we've seen that happening as well in parastatals. But I'll stop you for the time being.
That's true.
So that we take a break before we go into the third segment. That's Rejoice Ngwenya, who is our economic analyst. Today we are discussing privatization, the advantages and disadvantages. We've looked at its history, and we've also looked at best practices around the world. Join us in the third segment. We're now in the third segment of Economic Forum, where today we are discussing privatization with our economic analyst, Rejoice Ngwenya. Rejoice, we mentioned in passing that we are going to be looking at the full advantages and disadvantages. Let's go into that.
Absolutely, John. Thanks very much. It's a fantastic question. You know, when you talk about money that has been invested in a state business, you are looking at the outcome, efficiency, utility, that is satisfaction, and so forth. So these are the traits that we normally track in looking at privatization. One of the key aspects is competitiveness. Remember, privatization only without deregulation creates a monopoly. So you don't want to privatize a sector and end up with a private monopoly. You also want to make sure that you deregulate your market so that you invite other competitors. Why do you need competitors? Because competition keeps the prices down, right? And improves innovation. They will be hustling around for fantastic packages, and we have seen it in the telecommunication sector. We've got about 3 or 4 telecom companies in Zimbabwe, and they're all competing to give us special packages. That is the advantage. One of the biggest advantages in an environment in the 21st century. You also want choice. You want to open up the menu of service and product delivery and see competition and look at the prices and
choose what you want.
And choose what you want. Because when you have a state monopoly or even a private monopoly, there's no choice. You are only stuck with one genre of products and services. So price competitiveness is important, and innovation. And last, of course, is efficiency. John, you also want an efficient delivery of service. If I'm going to get electricity 2 days after I want it, it doesn't make any sense. If I'm going to get water, if I'm going to stand in a bus stop, John, and get a public bus coming 2 hours after, it's not good enough. So efficiency is very, very important. I love efficiency. I would rather pay a high price for something efficient than pay a low price for something inefficient, because money is time. So I would say that there's some of the key areas, John, that we look at in terms of the advantages of privatization. Yes.
Yeah. But there are also disadvantages.
Big.
A few of them.
There are disadvantages. Yes. First of all, public assets generally are meant to be public assets.
You're now talking, Rejoice.
Yeah, I'm talking.
Like the economists that you are referring to.
I'm talking.
These are public assets. They belong to the nation. They are our heritage.
This is democratic discourse. Yes. No, what I'm saying is that in an environment where there's no rule of law, where there's corruption and all that, you will need a strong hand to control, to moderate that. It's important. And generally, usually citizens are quite happy to see their monies, controlled by a big father called government. Citizens ignore efficiency and focus on price and subsidies. So in other words, in a very, very poor economy, like most African countries, generally governments come in with subsidies in goods and services. It is not good. It creates a vicious cycle of dependence. You will never leave that cycle, John. Once you are used to a welfare state and benevolence, even if it's in our notes, we're talking about Rwanda. Right, you know what I mean? So those kind of governments are very good in the short term because you are given goods, they are subsidized and all that. But in the long term, when the market is now open, it will take them a long time to acquaint themselves to the forces of competition. So which means when Africa is talking about an integrated market, you can't compete as a government. You need private investors to compete on your behalf, yes.
What is the future of privatization in Zimbabwe? Maybe just an overview of the African continent.
I'm glad that NDSI, talked a lot about, privatization, although it's more skewed towards parallel reform. But my strong belief, John, is that as the borders open more and more, the African free trade area, the SADC protocols and so forth, as they open more, governments will discover that it does not pay to be involved in business. There will be so much demand for high-level skills in articulating business concepts and integration, upward, vertical, horizontal. So the government...
We've got them in our ministries, we've got them in our parastatals, highly educated people, and they will continue to be retrained.
Yeah, but that's true, John.
What is it that then lacks there?
But will they deliver goods at a competitive price in an innovative way? This is where the question is. So the government can do all it wants to maintain infrastructure for electricity supply, for roads and all that. But this is why I'm talking about when the borders open, when the continental free trade area is in full force, there will be no government in Africa that will be capable of competing against private companies, because we will have huge corporates that are run by Africans, like Dangote, a kind of character. So imagine if a government was running a cement company, John, would they compete against Dangote? No, they won't. If a government is running an airline, will they compete against private airlines? No. So the future of Africa is in understanding the dynamics of an open market, an open border that puts you against other key individuals that are within the same sector. So it will be difficult for governments to compete, John, in the same arena as African multinational companies. So I'm looking 20 years from now, 30 years from now, we are going to be having big multinational companies owned and controlled by Africans. So their governments will sit there and they will simply say to them, please, Mr. Government, concentrate on policy and regulations and good governance and forget about business, because you are not going to compete there, and win.
Where is our education and training taking us to, so that we become efficient, whether we're in government, whether we're in private companies, and there are no anomalies that you've just mentioned? Wherever you are, just be efficient. Where is our kind of education that we are receiving today taking us to, as far as
John,
efficiency and effectiveness is concerned?
I can tell you that in the future governments, integrity and credibility won't be based on how loud you sing, party, slogans. It's going to be based on merit. So the future governments, which are going to be run by young African generations, they will be based on efficiency. In other words, if you are going to be minister of whatever or a member of parliament of whatever and sit in a portfolio committee, you should produce your credibility first. So the mentality of business will be such that the governments will be run by people that understand business, because our lives will be driven by internet, the Internet of Things, which totally ignores political, naivety. So we are looking at the future. The governments will be focusing on the best thing they can do, which is government. I won't be surprised if I resurrect 50 years from now, right? The Harare to Bulawayo road will be run by a private company. It's going to be very possible, and there will be no state supply of electricity.
But in 30 seconds, how is current education moving towards that area?
It should move. We are not saying it's moving towards that area, but it's moving towards that area because we are globalizing our curriculum so that it fits within the dictates and the demands of international study. So we are going to be forced to move into the global arena of curriculum.
Rejoice Ngwenya, an economic analyst, would like to thank you very much for coming on to Economic Forum to talk about privatization. Rejoice has been talking about the advantages and disadvantages of privatization and why commercialization in many cases has failed. He has also touched on the parastatal reform program and how it has not realized the fruits that were expected, and many other things, including best practices around the world. We'd like to thank you very much, Rejoice, for coming on to Economic Forum, and we also want to thank our technical team, that is the production team. This is John Maso.